Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's JStream webinar. We are today going to be talking about a new Biden administration and the impact that it may have on Israelis and Palestinians. I understand that we have quite a large number of folks who have signed up to join us on today's webinar, which is fantastic. So I am just gabbing for a moment while we give everyone a chance to log on and join our webinar. And in just a second, I will be introducing our two panelists. So welcome to everyone as you join us today. Okay, so given everybody a minute or so to join, we will really get started this time. And again, welcome everyone to this JStream webinar on the view from the region about the new Biden administration and what sort of impact that it might have on Israelis and Palestinians. As we all well know, on these past 4 years, we have been on quite a ride with the Trump administration and really I would say the unprecedented damage that it has done as far as US policy in the region toward Israelis and Palestinians and more broadly is concerned. And fortunately, from my perspective, the end is in sight. January 20th is in view from now, and we are speeding toward a new administration headed by President-elect Joe Biden. And so today we are joined by two great experts, one Israeli and one Palestinian, who are going to share their thoughts with us. And without further ado, I am excited to introduce the two of them to you. And I'm going to start with Dr. Shira Efron. She is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, in Israel, the important Israeli think tank. She is in addition, a special advisor on Israel with the RAND Corporation. And she's also an adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Dr. Efron's research focuses on US policy toward the Middle East, including on Israeli ties with China, the Israeli-Arab conflict, and the nexus between climate change and national security. Her prior affiliations include working with the Center for American Progress here in DC, as well as with the Middle East Institute. And she holds a PhD from RAND's graduate school. Welcome to you, Dr. Shira Efron. We're delighted to have you here with us today. And I will also introduce our other panelist, Mr. Ibrahim Eid Dalalsha, who is a senior political consultant based in the West Bank. He heads up a private think tank in Ramallah called the Horizon Center for Political Studies and Media Outreach. Mr. Eid Dalalsha's prior experiences are also very interesting. Previously, he was had a former career as a senior political advisor at the US Consulate General in Jerusalem that stretched across 2 decades. And he was twice named the State Department's Foreign Service National of the Year for outstanding political reporting. He played an integral role in peace negotiations across the Middle East, including the ceasefire negotiations in 2014 in Cairo. He also worked for several years in the mid to late 90s as an officer with UNRWA, the UN Refugee and Works Agency. He worked with the National Democratic Institute, and he's currently pursuing a second master's in law. So I am actually going to turn off my camera in just a second because I have a little technical malfunction here at home. But before I do that, and I apologize if you are hearing noise in the background, which is that to which I am referring to, which I will take care of in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to just kick off our conversation and throw a question over to Ibrahim, which he can start answering. Ibrahim, I want to start with the issue of US-Palestinian relations. As we all know, thanks to the Trump administration, these have hit an all-time low over the past few years. And hopefully under a new Biden administration, there's an opportunity to reset. So, Ibrahim, I wonder if you might share with us the views and voices that you're hearing from across Palestinian society and what folks in the West Bank and Gaza are thinking about prospects under a future Biden administration. I'll let you answer, and forgive me for just a second while I turn off my camera. Over to you, Ibrahim.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much for the introduction and for this opportunity. As relates to the question, basically, I have to be frank and tell you that, if we go about voices in the Palestinian street, opinions of factions, average people, and so on, there is lots of frustration out there. Even looking at the past, and basically there is a wide-held view that there are very few, if any, differences between Republicans and Democrats, and then you would see this reflected in statements by some PLO factions, maybe in some public opinion polls that might be done in the future. But as regards the mainstream Palestinian leadership, and as you pointed out, the relations between the Palestinians and the U.S. have never been as low as they were under the Trump administration. From a Palestinian perspective, there was a fierce, if you will, political, diplomatic, economic, financial attack on the Palestinian leadership. And this, started actually with closing the PLO office in Washington in 2017, moving to actually cutting assistance, and then trying to impose, the Jerusalem Proclamation, which took off East Jerusalem as subject, or one of the subject matters for negotiations between the two sides, and throwing it basically just off the table, just as simple as that, as was stated repeatedly by President Trump in the past. We had earlier this year, the announcement or release of the long-awaited peace plan, or so-called peace plan. Of course, that plan from Palestinian perspective was disastrous. So all those elements were basically, an extremely difficult things for the Palestinians to deal with. And, as such, there was a total boycott in terms of the political contacts between the two sides. So in moving basically to the post-U.S. elections, and in preparation for it, I think that the Palestinian leadership, the mainstream Palestinian leadership, has been and still is working to engage as quickly as possible with the new U.S. administration, based on the political statements, the public statements that were made, whether it be by President-elect or by Vice President, even before they were elected, on the things that they are willing to do when it comes to the Palestinian, to strike a balance again to the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and mainly starting with the US-Palestinian relations. As you pointed out earlier, there are lots of things that have been damaged and that they need fixing. So the view that is held by the Palestinian leadership, and I think that translates into policies and practical steps, and we have seen some of it, is working, like with the Israelis in order to resume, all forms of security coordination, civil coordination, financial coordination, and prepare the ground, frankly, to engage with the U.S., with the new U.S. administration on broader and more important issues. And one thing that I have to mention here is that the Palestinian leadership, when they took decisions back in May 19, a few months back, to boycott and stop and not be bound by the agreements with Israel, it was all meant to actually, demonstrate the Palestinian response and refusal, not only to annexation plans that were announced by the Israeli Prime Minister, but more to actually the Trump peace plan that they completely reject as terms of reference for engagement with Israelis. So, now the Palestinians have been waiting patiently for the U.S. Elections, and could see that a change could come. And once we get to the January 20th, and I think even they are eager to engage before, and we have seen two things that have been done already. One is basically, resuming all contacts with the Israeli government, security, economic, and civil affairs. And second is basically, and we'll touch on this maybe later, but is also sending back the two Palestinian ambassadors who were recalled from two Arab capitals who had normalized relations with Israel, and that's the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and that actually just was announced half an hour ago. So that is, I would say in short, what the Palestinian leadership attitudes and positions and expectations, and preparations for engagement with the new U.S. administration.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Ibrahim.
Sure.
I just want to let folks know, and I hesitate to do this because I see that we have nearly 300 folks joining us today. So I'm setting myself up for disaster when I let you all know that you can submit your questions at the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom. I expect that I am soon going to be inundated with many, many questions because we have so many audience members today, which is wonderful. It's a great problem to have. But please do submit your questions to the Q&A, and I will get to as many as I have time to after a bit of further moderated discussion with our two speakers, Ibrahim and Shira. So Ibrahim, I want to follow up on your comments a little bit. Some of the developments that you've pointed to, do you see those as examples of an early Biden effect of Palestinian leadership showing that it is prepared to take some initial steps in order to stretch out its hand? And what do you think that Palestinian leaders expect to see early on from a Biden administration in return?
First of all, I would like to tell you, and I think I can speak on this point almost assertively, that the Palestinian leadership will not have preconditions or conditions to engage with the Biden administration. I don't think that that's their attitude, and I think their expectations are essentially, as I said earlier, built on what was said publicly already by representatives of the new administration at the most senior level. And I think that's an important point to state because, again, the damage that was done to the Palestinian interests in the past 4 years under the Trump administration was so tremendous to the point that they actually now think of short-term, medium-term, and longer-term engagement with the administration. There is no expectation, to be very honest with you, that the administration will be able to fix the Palestinian sort of like Israeli conflict in the next few months or next few weeks. And that's not what the Palestinian sort of like expectation is about, because some people say, look, the new administration has so many priorities, and Palestinians need to be, to understand that this is not going to be a fast track fixing of the conflict. And the truth of the matter is, before we get to a point where political process needs to engage, assume with the Israelis, we need to fix the damage. And I think the Palestinian Authority has already done what it could to fix the damage, the immediate damage, in terms of cutting all contacts with the Israeli government, and that was done yesterday. And then, when looking ahead towards the new administration taking office, the expectation is that, and again, these are not preconditions, but I think the expectations are on three main tracks. One is or points. One is to take off the so-called U.S. Vision of Peace and Prosperity type, plan that's the Trump or Kushner plan. Because that does not meet the minimal expectations of Palestinians, and we don't need to discuss why. I think everyone who is involved enough, who knows enough, will understand why Palestinians have so many reservations, in fact, that they completely reject it. Second is to oppose settlement expansion and annexation, which came also embedded in the Trump peace plan. Second, to balance the Jerusalem Proclamation of 2017 by opening a U.S. consulate as a mission to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And three, to reopen the PLO office in DC. And there, I think I could actually even add that this is one of the issues that I think the Palestinians have been thinking about and would want to get to a point where the PLO office would not really be an office of a terrorist organization that is waived every 6 months to operate. They would like to have that upgraded. They would like that representation to match what the Palestinian Authority and what the PLO have been doing in terms of engagement with the U.S., whether on security and Israel, whether on security coordination or political process. So this is not the PLO of the 60s. This is the PLO of 2021. And as such, that would be one of the expectations where they would have or would want to have an upgraded status, not just reopening the PLO office. And that in some, I would say all of that would be in preparation to restore. Actually, that will be restoring Palestinian-American relations. Of course, assistance is something that would be expected, but I don't think, again, it's a precondition. And then, moving from that point forward to prepare for a more serious engagement in terms of peace process, that in terms of peace talks that would actually take into account all the mistakes of the past, try to fix them and move in a much more concrete way that would actually meet and achieve more concrete results this time around.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Ibrahim. I have one more question that I want to ask you that follows from what you've just talked about, and then I'll be turning to Shira with some questions on the Israeli side. But just following up on what you've just said, and reflecting on those points you've made in terms of Palestinian hopes and expectations from a Biden administration. They all, of course, just to give my own 2 cents, completely important and sensible. Some of those things the Biden administration has indicated ahead of time that it has intention to do, and so that's positive. Some of these things are, fall clearly under the mandate of the U.S. president. In terms of the prerogative of the president to make foreign policy. So some of these things, the Biden administration could, if it wanted to do, could do them on day one or very early in the administration. There are also, some items on the list that are more complicated, like the PLO mission, for example, because that would require statutory changes from Congress. And so, nonetheless important, but some of the things that we at J Street are thinking about in terms of, helping to create this reset and, which things that we can raise with the future Biden administration and what sort of things need to be done in terms of congressional action. But there's one thing that I did want to follow up on, again, from what you said, and it's the issue of aid, humanitarian aid that benefits Palestinians. And I note that we did get a question in the Q&A, so I'm going to just bring that in from Barbara Gallitz, who says that she would love to hear your thoughts on U.S. assistance to UNRWA and the Palestinians under the upcoming administration, whether you think it will be restored and at what level, higher or lower than it has been, what you expect in terms of similar or more or less restrictions, and just noting that given that you did work for UNRWA for several years, would love to hear your perspective on this and the importance of aid.
Yes. If you allow me, I just want to go back to one point, since you said that J Street is thinking about some of, specifically with regards to PLO office in DC. Just quickly, I want to tell you that I think I recall back in the days when I used to work for the U.S. government that there were thoughts of actually bypassing the whole PLO 87 Act of Anti-Terrorism Act, and try alternative tracks that could be faster, like opening a PA office in DC, because the American law or the U.S. laws have nothing to do against the PA in the same sense that they did on the PLO. There are so many different ways, as you said, if there is a political will to actually move and quickly to fix many things. But of course, I don't speak on behalf of the PA, but these actually come from my own experiences and discussions that we had in the past on these difficult issues. In terms of UNRWA and the assistance, humanitarian assistance, and frankly, yes, I did work for UNRWA, and I think every players know I mean, there are it's twofold kind of organization. One, it's a major, like stability factor, and has played that for years. And everyone wants to see UNRWA eventually dismantled, and basically, a resolution to the conflict is reached, whereby the Palestinian state would absorb the refugees, and however and whichever the solution to the refugee problem will be, it will coincide with actually dismantling UNRWA. Killing UNRWA prematurely, as was done by the Trump administration, would have been, in my opinion, had it not been for other countries and other sort of like donors jumping in to save it, would have had disastrous consequences, not only on Palestinians, frankly, but even on the region, because that the refugees are scattered in the region, and not only in the West Bank and Gaza. So I would say that for the sake and good of Palestinian refugees, the all the regional interests and security interests, in fact, UNRWA's problems need to be fixed, and again go parallel into ways that would ensure UNRWA's dismantlement will come when a solution is actually achieved, and not kill it instantly by, in my opinion, reckless policies and decisions that would have only hurt all those concerned, including Israelis, Palestinians, and the other countries in the region. So yes, I think it's definite, and one of the and needed, and one of the things that I didn't really focus in my presentation in terms of Palestinian expectations was UNRWA and assistance, because I reiterate that none of those issues are going to be preconditions. It's fixing the damage. The U.S. has been the major contributor to UNRWA with deep understanding of this situation until 2016. And I'm not going to say more.
Great. Thank you, Ibrahim. I also want to thank our audience members for, I knew I was opening myself up, but tons of great questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. But for now, I want to move to Shira and ask some questions related to the new Biden administration and Israel. Let's start with the Israeli government and reading the tea leaves a little bit in terms of the response of the Israeli government to Biden administration. Obviously, Dr. Efron, you know very well that Prime Minister Netanyahu has attached himself very closely to President Trump here in the United States. It took Netanyahu a long time to acknowledge the election victory of President-elect Biden, and even longer to reach out with a phone call, as he and President Reuven Rivlin did yesterday. But I do note that if you go to Twitter and you look at Bibi Netanyahu's profile, you will still see a banner picture of him with President Trump. So just interested if you could read the tea leaves a little bit and talk a little bit about the Israeli government's reaction to the election, and in what kind of position does this put, for example, Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. I appreciate your interest, and I'm really happy to be here with my friend Ibrahim. I generally agree with him on everything. I just want to say about UNRWA that I think it's interesting with UNRWA because, unlike other aid to the Palestinians that had to go through Congress, and there's no legal impediment with just reinstituting aid to UNRWA tomorrow. It's an executive decision. So in a sense, it's easier. Politically, it's not going to be as easy, but I know from people in UNRWA, they're optimistic. They don't expect, $180 million check today, but they are optimistic. It would be very interesting to see how fast this is instituted, given the political environment, and that's gonna affect things going forward. The Israeli, so we can divide the Israeli government, the Israeli public. It's really interesting. I will tell you that in conversations I've had, totally off the record, I'm not going to mention names, but with Israeli officials before the elections, they explained to me why Nate Silver didn't know what he was talking about and Trump was going to win. They had an uncle that visited a diner in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and we don't know anything, and we were wrong in 2016, and pollsters were wrong, and polls don't provide any indication, and Trump is going to get reelected. And I think this thinking also didn't prepare them for the other outcome, which, we all, based on data, and we can speak about polls, and polls pollsters making mistakes, but there was clear indication that this was going to be the election results. However, Israel has not prepared. Formal Israel has not prepared. They didn't make contingency plans. So I think it took them some time to come to terms with it. The moment they came to terms with it, which I think was quicker than some circles in the US, but then what do you do with it, right? What do you do? Because Trump is still the president. And would you test, if he holds grudges? I mean, it's not just also, this is in the Israeli mindset, the Netanyahu government, he was great for Netanyahu. Netanyahu also thinks he was great for Israel. I defer, but there's this is an administration who was very favorable to our government. And he can get angry, and we don't know what he's going to do to us if we call Biden first to congratulate, if we call him president-elect. And so I think they were very careful. I was actually really, I saw Xi Jinping of China called a few days later in the competition between MBS, Netanyahu wasn't the last one to congratulate. So I think they were hedging, and they were pretty responsible in the way they handled it going forward. Of course, now, and we can speak about the actual policies, what are they trying to do in the last few weeks of the Trump administration? Sanctions on Iran. Pompeo is here. There's just a letter from Senator Tom Cotton calling for not distinguishing between products made in the settlements, which he calls Judea and Samaria and Israel. Pompeo is visiting a settlement for the first time. So all these things, what can we extract more that supports us in the remaining days of this administration? I think it's also really interesting in the terms of the Israeli public, because the Israeli public really supported Trump. But not, I dare to say that the main reason for support was the fact that he seemed as good for Israel, and it goes beyond there's Jerusalem and the Golan, but he seemed like a protector of Israel in the international forum, and we can give him credit that under his administration, Israel has new peace agreements with Arab countries. So we can speak about the transactional nature and stuff, but at the end of the day, the outcome is, so the Israeli public supported Trump. It's not like they think of Biden as anti-Israel or against Israel, but it's more like, oh, we're losing someone who we know has got our back. So I think that's the general sentiment when they think about foreign policy issues. I want to remind everyone, Israel's, like the rest of the world, struggling with COVID, 20% unemployment, unprecedented crisis, deficit that Israel has not seen one in decades. So foreign policy is not the top of the agenda, but when the public thinks about the US, this is where they are, most people.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Shira, for that view of reaction to the Biden administration, both from the Israeli government and also from the Israeli public. That's really helpful. I want to ask you, Shira, another question and shift gears a little bit to the subject of annexation. So we know that, it appears that de jure annexation seems to be off the table, at least for now. And that seems to be at least partly, I'm sure not entirely, a result of those normalization agreements that you've referenced between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. But I'd like to talk a little bit really about creeping annexation and the developments that we continue to see on the ground with announcements for further housing units and settlements, including the building tenders in the very sensitive area of Givat Hamatos. So my question is whether you think there are any actions that a Biden administration could take that would address creeping annexation and that the Israeli government would actually be responsive to.
Sure. So I think it's a really good point about the annexation. It was, the normalization agreements provided a face-saving way to prevent the annexation, but in all truth, I'm not sure Netanyahu really meant to do it until the last minute. I don't even know if he knew himself he was going to do it. And we should give credit to a lot of actors for preventing it. the UAE, they reaped the fruits, but there was the Jordanians and very important voice from the United States, and voices from Europe that stopped it. So I think everyone should get credit for it. And I think it's very positive that it did not happen, okay? Because that's harder to reverse. In terms of the de facto creeping annexation, yes, and we're seeing even more so, right? With the Givat Matos tenders, which are in the Jerusalem area, a very sensitive area that deemed to damage the possibility of having a contiguous Palestinian state, in the West Bank. But it is important to remind listeners that the longest and the most substantial, the most significant freeze of settlements actually happened during the Obama administration, the first tenure. Not so much because there was a threat, there was also a lot of subtext. I don't think it was handled correctly because there was no distinction between, natural growth and different settlements that are deemed really that, inside what you call the settlement blocks, the ones that are going to remain under Israeli control no matter what, even under the Geneva Initiative, okay, plans. The most, there wasn't a distinction, it wasn't done, but we've seen that this could happen. A lot would depend on this question. A lot would depend on what the Biden administration actually does. But I do think that the Israeli government, given the right set of circumstances, which would include some stakes and maybe some incentives, you might want to tie it to bigger regional issues, what Israel wants on Iran. Subtext, a friendly administration doesn't just come with threats, but also not being a pushover, can stop building outside of, let's say, the separation barrier, right? Stop with the distant settlements. Settlements that are even under Israeli law are deemed illegal, were deemed illegal at least. There are multiple plans for, the West Bank under the Oslo agreements was divided into areas A, B, and C, and we can go into the details. There have been a lot of plans of how can we take area C and convert them to area B. These are things that I think some circles in Israel, they would be okay accommodating. Now, of course, there's political issue considerations, and Israel's going to be in elections again in 2021, probably middle of the year. So it's not going to be easy, but I think that with the right approach from the Biden administration, there's a chance of success and Israeli acceptance of this reality and abiding by it. The initiative will not come from Israel, I fear. It would have been great, but I don't think it's going to come from Israel.
Thank you so much for that, Shira. So what I'd like to do now is actually throw out a few related questions that I'm going to try to package together here a little bit and give both of you, Ibrahim and Shira, a chance to respond to the parts that you feel compelled to speak on. Or interested to speak on. So I'd like to get at the questions a little bit of what dialogue and negotiations might look like going forward. And we had a couple of folks among our audience who asked specifically about Saeb Erekat, who tragically, of course, died very recently. He was the longtime chief negotiator of the Palestinians. And so the question has come, and Ibrahim, if you could address this, what impact Saeb Erekat's tragic death will have on the prospects for further negotiations, who you might expect to take up his mantle from within the Palestinian leadership. Additionally, just to throw out a couple more questions kind of in this round of questioning, we have a question from Marcia Yerman, who asked whether the two of you would like to see a special envoy appointed by Biden outside of his cabinet who would be tasked with handling the Israel-Palestine portfolio. Would that be a fruitful way of moving forward? And then the third question that I'm going to throw into this round, into this package, is about the issue of multilateralism, right? Is it, have we gotten to the point where it's important to really, beyond just the United States as the chief mediator, that we bring in a more prominent way other actors And could you point to actors who you think should be more prominently involved and that would be productive? So Ibrahim, why don't I throw it to you first, and then Shira will give you a chance to respond as well.
Okay, with regards to the tragic passing of late Dr. Erekat, frankly, I think that you know we have many Palestinians who have been working very closely with Dr. Saib in terms of negotiations up to 2014. That actually includes even Prime Minister Shtaya, who was actually the peer negotiator with him. We also have other people and other officials, including you know, General Majid Faraj, who was also you know, a point of contact, and he you know, participated in all negotiations with Dr. Saib Erekat. So in recent years, I think that you know you know, the past 4 years we did not have negotiations, unfortunately, and as such the role diminished. But I think you know, in moving to you know, the January 20th and beyond, I think that there will be no shortage of Palestinian officials who will fill in that gap. And I hope, you know, to the benefit of all parties, including Palestinians, you know, interests. And it's not going to be, you know, I don't think that it's going to be a gap unfilled, so to speak. In terms of his other positions, you know, Dr. Saab had few positions. Secretary General of the PLO position is not necessarily connected to negotiations, frankly. It's a separate function. And even in past years, just before Dr. Arqad took it over, you know, it was an un-Fatah person in that position. So, you know, if we want to focus, and I think that's the face that the world knew Dr. Saib in, you know, being the point of contact or chief negotiator. Again, as I said, there are many, and I'm not going to name names because I don't really know who the president will eventually choose to fill in that position. But what I know is that there is no shortage of people, and even those who aspire to take, you know, that position with good qualifications and experience and relevant working experience, you know, together with Dr. Saeb in the past years, up to 2014 with Secretary Kerry. That's specifically what I'm referring to. So that's actually on this question. In terms of envoy, the you know, appointment of an envoy, I could think of many names that would actually fill in that kind of position, and I do think yes, with the big tasks that the you know, that POTUS has in you know, he needs to have someone who would focus on it. It can't be a full-time job for a Secretary of State, obviously. So there needs to be an envoy, whether from the bureaucracy or someone that is appointed by the president, not from State Department. I think that would be a better choice. And names come to mind. I'm not going to name names, but there are many characters and many people in the US who have played this role. And one of the most, you know, I have to actually say at this point, one of the things that I've heard in the past four awkward years is that because, you know, negotiations in the past failed, we need to try a different approach. So they destroyed, you know, the negotiations and even Palestinian-Israeli relations when it came even to security coordination and other forms of contacts. What I think is the right approach is basically collect every single experience and every single you know, mistake, and the experts who actually did work on this issue, and try to basically avoid them in the next sort of like round, or in the next effort that will be launched in order to get Palestinians and Israelis on the right track. I don't want to go longer than this. You know, the third question, I'm not sure whether it was actually addressed to me or to Shira. You had
The third question on multilateralism, feel free to take
yes,
it on.
yes. Multilateralism, you know, I would like to actually say that multilateralism is a long-standing Palestinian demand. And if we go to early 2000, I think it was President Clinton who, and it was his administration that actually created the Quartet forum that has been there for so many years. And one of the models that were used was actually dealing with the Iranian file, the 5+1, 6+1. However, you know, I think that from a Palestinian perspective, multilateralism is a must. I would think, you know, like with the Trump administration, they had an exclusive, you know, but basically they were saying there will be no role for the U.S. as a sole mediator. It must be, under a multilateral umbrella. I think this still stands. I think that might be softened. That's my own opinion, with the Biden administration. But, I think, they would welcome more sort of like, European countries. I know that they've been demanding, countries like, even China, Japan, all countries that would have an interest in basically sponsoring and being part of a multilateral framework to encourage both Israelis and Palestinians to move forward is something that the Palestinians would welcome. And again, as I said, it has been a Palestinian demand. I'm not sure how does that translate on Shira's side, how the Israeli government, whether this government or a new government, if they have a new government in the near future, would address this. But what I know from experience is that the Israelis never wanted, or the Israeli governments never wanted a real sort of like multilateralism approach or framework that would be empowered. And previous U.S. administrations went around that. In some cases, even President George Bush did actually call in the Annapolis conference. And again, from a Palestinian perspective, it's always a welcome idea, and this is something that they actually want and seek.
Thank you so much for that, Ibrahim. Shira, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I think, in Saeb Erekat, I think it was really sad. The Israeli, unfortunately, the political echelon in Israel did not express condolences, except for one Likud member. I mean, not him. There was another one from Likud. There was one. I think, though, it's really a shame that we're not seeing sort of like next generation on the Palestinian leadership. They're all quite elderly. Saeb Erekat was, was sick with lung transplant. I mean, I wish there was more training and mentoring for next generation. And I think this is also symbolic of the succession debate, right? When we're talking about Abu Mazen, I hope he lives for many, many more years and in good health. But you're seeing this kind of experts and on this conflict, and where is where's going to be the institutional memory? But I think and personalities do matter. So I think in Saeb Erekat, it's really important. A lot of people talk about how smart he was and how dedicated he was and how committed he was to nonviolence. But he was such a mensch. He had a good sense of humor, and I think a lot of people really liked him on the personal level. So, I think it's also a loss on the Israeli part, even though many Israelis didn't like him because he was a tough negotiator. On the question that you asked on before multilateralism, what was it? Sorry, I'm blanking on.
No, it's okay. The question before that was about a special envoy.
Oh, a special envoy. Listen, I actually think that it would be good if there's a dedicated person, a special envoy, but I would not replicate the George Mitchell, someone with high profile. I actually think it needs to be a professional, low profile, someone who works behind the scene and is dedicated to this. I think that the price of disappointment again is too high, and we have to be realistic. The political circumstances have not changed. In fact, they probably worsened after, I don't want to say damage, but the effects of the Trump administration's last 4 years. Israel emboldened, Palestinians weakened, the same leadership on both sides. Israel's turned even more to the right, their elections. It would be very hard to achieve the diplomatic breakthrough of it, but you can make small steps. But it's better to, in my view, it's probably better to be more modest in your expectations and not having an envoy in the limelight. And Ibrahim is right. There are many people who can do this. It doesn't have to be, but definitely not. I don't think it should be like the president putting his envoy or Secretary of State putting his envoy as someone. You don't put the president's credibility on the line for this issue at this point in time. If the conditions change, if circumstances change, there's an opening, certainly. So you can have an envoy, and it would be great to have an envoy, but not the big names. On multilateralism, Israel has always been against it. Israel trusts the United States. I think after the last administration, probably Israel even trusted the United States even more. But the United States is not supposed to be Israel's lawyers. For a long time, the United States was supposed to be a mediator between Israelis and Palestinians, right? So for that, first of all, they have to fix their relationship with the Palestinian people, which I know, well, who knows who's going to get this portfolio, but I think a lot of people on the Biden campaign team and the Middle East team are thinking about it, and they realize they have to do that. So that would be the first thing. But it is a point where we can think about the stakes. It's not just the Americans. The Americans now, Biden's going to change that probably, but they're not even like giving money to the Palestinians, right? They're not even involved in the aid. The Europeans basically are funding, they're bankrolling the PA, right? All aid to Gaza. Why don't the Europeans have a stake in this? They do as part of the office of the quartet, but why don't they have an actual office, a political role, not just in development role? And because I don't know about China and the US, this gets into a little more complicated things, but if we think of like Arab quartet, we think about Egypt, we think about the UAE, maybe other countries you can bring into this now. And the Biden administration has said that the Trump administration weakened US partnerships and alliances around the world. So maybe this is another area where they can say, well, we want to repair our alliances, we want to work together with partners, and this would be another topic on which you can partner with allies and partners. So there might be an opening. Of course, Israel is not the only party here that its interests should be taken into consideration.
Great, thank you. So much more to draw out here, and I'm going to try to get to as much as I can. Thanks to everyone who's contributed questions. I'm going to turn here to a question from Bruce Waxman that picks up on some of the things we've talked about so far, and Shira's comments just now about multilateralism and mentioning the UAE. Bruce asks, can the UAE play a role in a multinational solution? I want to add a couple of more questions that are related and give both of you a chance to answer them. One of the questions is whether you see the Biden administration continuing to lead and push on these normalization agreements. So far, Israel has normalized relations with UAE, with Bahrain. Sudan has also announced that it intends to normalize, and there are other countries potentially in the pipeline. Do you think that this will continue to be a priority for the United States under President Biden? And, following from that, is there a way that a Biden administration could pursue normalization in a way that's a lot more productive and beneficial for Palestinians, in a way that doesn't kind of throw the Arab Peace Initiative in the trash can and, leverages some of these new relationships that Israel has with Arab states in a way that could actually, help to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and end the occupation? So which of you would like to tackle that first? I'm accepting volunteers.
Ladies first, so I leave it to Shira unless she wants me to. So no
Shira,
problem.
please.
Look, I don't know what the Biden administration is going to try to do. It makes sense that they would try to build on this momentum because normalization between Israel and Arab countries has been a bipartisan, U.S. policy for a long time, with or without the Palestinians. And it started in Madrid, right? Like this was a big part of it. I don't know if it's going to be a priority. Frankly, I don't think the Middle East is going to be a priority for the Biden administration in the beginning. There's Iran, which is a separate issue that will make itself a priority if it's not being treated, but on the other stuff. But there could be opportunities. Saudi might see this as a way of under Biden administration, Saudi is going to be less welcome in Washington and also in Congress. We know that Egypt did it before, Jordan did it. You find your way into Congress by normalizing ties with Israel. That's a good way of doing it. They might do it. So there could be opportunities, and I think the Biden administration would be very smart to capitalize on them. They should, in my view, and there are people there that know, let's tie this to the Palestinian issue. So in a sense, Sudan was really transactional, and Bahrain, you can say that the UAE, it was connected to stopping annexation, right? can we connect? Can we link the next normalization deals to more meaningful gains on the Palestinian front? And you can, right? Especially with a country like Saudi, is way more sensitive, in Morocco, where there's public more sensitive, in Kuwait, there are others. So I think they would like to do that, and and it's too early, in my view, to say that the Arab Peace Initiative is gone and the whole paradigm shifted completely. It was never either or, right? How do you do both at the same time? This is the new reality, and and I hope they do it, but I hope they do it in a wise way. And I hope that the Palestinians, and this will go to Ibrahim. I do know, and I know that firsthand, and we're probably not speaking with the same Palestinians, but I know firsthand there were people, many in Israel, that when this was cooked with the UAE, behind the scenes, there were Israelis telling the Palestinians, how about you go and let's write something together. Let's make sure that in the agreements themselves, you get something for yourself. Let's try to put in settlement free something. And I don't know if Israel would have agreed, right? We don't know that. But from my understanding, the Palestinians did not play ball. They did not try to shape the agreements. They opposed them. And I hope that all the parties have learned the lessons going forward. That's my view. I don't know what Ibrahim thinks.
That opens the door for you, Ibrahim.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. Well, I would like actually to start by saying that this evening the PA announced that they are sending back the two ambassadors that they had called for consultations to Ramallah. One to I think the one to Bahrain already arrived, and the other ambassador is on his way back to the United Arab Emirates. What I want to say is that I think the Palestinian position on these normalization deals was was distorted in many ways, and not intentionally, but basically I think there was lots of developments and quick developments that happened around the Abraham Accords that actually made the Palestinian position look what it was not really about. The Palestinians, since the Arab Peace Initiative was endorsed by Arab Summit in 2002 in Beirut, they were actually the first proponents and the ones who would actually market and go out and actually took it to the Organization of Islamic Countries and turned it from an Arab initiative into an Islamic countries initiative, and eventually working with President Bush, it got into the UN Resolution 1515 in 2005. So it is all about normalization. What the Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership was shocked about is two things. One is that it came as part of the Trump administration effort to impose a final status solution, so-called, again, U.S. vision of peace and prosperity, which is completely rejected. And second, take away the main incentive for normalization, which Israel would be entitled to once there is withdrawal, basically once you get to a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Those 2 points were basically what made the Palestinians in a shock, because of what happened under the Trump administration. And the reality is, again, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the one that needs to be resolved, because with all due respect, and yes, all Arab countries and the region want to live in coexistence, but there has been no war. I mean, this is not like, between Emirates and Bahrain and Israel. This is not Egypt. This is not Jordan, where those two countries had wars and conflict, and Palestinians are in the heart of conflict with Israelis, where you need to focus efforts. So, the Palestinian position was, I think, unintentionally distorted. And as I said, sending back the two ambassadors to the two Arab capitals is again a sign on the PAs showing that everything that they were fearful of and concerned about in terms of the Trump plans are gone by his by him losing the elections. And I have to actually say that I don't think that the Palestinian leadership or people actually believe that annexation stopped because of the Emirates deal with Israel. I mean, that was said, but it was denied by the US ambassador to Israel, by the Israeli prime minister. This is only suspension. So in other words, Palestinians were saying, if Trump will be re-elected, then annexation will come back again. It has nothing to do with the normalization deal with the Emirates or with Bahrain. Now, regardless of this, because that's past, I'm saying that the Palestinians are willing to engage with the US administration, but new and clear terms of reference. The signed agreements which the Israeli government sent a letter with, those are terms where the Palestinians could come, and you could imagine a Biden administration would do parallel tracks where you launch a Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations with, I would actually say, multifaceted tracks to improve life. I'm not talking about confidence building measures, but to open, security coordination, deepening it, and making it actually, protecting Palestinians against settlers' attacks, not only, Palestinians against Israelis' attacks. You bring in economic, Paris Protocol. You actually, open it. You move and transfer areas to the PA in parallel with peace negotiations on strategic issues. And you move with other, normalization agreements in the region. There are ways to engage, but the problem is, again, from a Palestinian perspective, I think was the mother of all trouble was that peace plan and the tremendous pressure that was put by the Trump administration, not only on Palestinians, but also on Arab countries to normalize prematurely, leaving the Palestinians behind and taking the incentives that would be given to the state of Israel, which actually emboldens the Israeli right-wing position, not only, Israeli public position. So, that is what I have to say on normalization and how this could be approached by the Biden administration.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. So we are nearing the end of our hour. And so as I like to do, we're going to have a final lightning round for our panelists. I'm going to throw out a few questions and just comment on that which grabs your fancy. I also see that there's a question in the Q&A. Will the video recording be made available? Which is a great question because this is a fantastic discussion we're having today. I'm happy to say yes, that it will be available on the J Street website, jstreet.org, afterwards. So questions, here we go. Ready? For Shira, if you could address the question about Israeli domestic politics and the impact that they might have. It looks like Israel is probably going to be moving to elections yet again over the course of the next year. And so what impact might that have? What about Netanyahu's legal woes? What will be the impact of all of that? For Ibrahim, question from you that comes from Michael Nathanson about whether reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas is necessary for progress, and can the Biden administration positively impact reconciliation? And finally, if either of you want to say a word about Pompeo's visit to Israel that's happening right now, and of course it's not just a visit to Israel, he's going to be heading to the Psagot winery to drink some wine with his name on it, and what impact could that have as the Trump administration is on its way out? So Shira, why don't we start with you and grab anything there that meets your fancy?
I mean, there's going to be elections probably in June, just because of like the budget stuff that is not passed. We can go into it, but it's automatically going to be triggering elections. If there's no elections by June, it means that Netanyahu has to transfer the prime ministership to Benny Gantz, and it's very clear he's not doing that. So we can assume, I think, on June, July elections. I think in terms of his trial, the trial is beginning, but we know that's going to be a very lengthy trial because his lawyers and him will find every excuse not to appear in court, to say there's a security incident and stuff. So there's no there's going to be a legal trial. Netanyahu is going to be out. It's going to be a new leader. I think it's too early to say who's going to be instead of Netanyahu. I will tell you that from the Israeli perspective now, even when we had the annexation threat as a very credible threat, the Israeli public did not care. It's not on the agenda. All the people care about is public health and the economy. 20% unemployment in Israel. There was 4% unemployment 8 months ago. The deficit, they're printing money. I don't think it's a deficit that Israel's going to recover in my lifetime. Services are hurt. Schools are closed. Israel's after a second lockdown. So to think that this will be a priority and that the Israeli public cares, it's just not there. There could be a circumstances that would have to be led by the United States, which would make the Israeli leadership agree to move in constructive ways. And I'm optimistic, but I don't see a viable political alternative to Netanyahu at the moment that is more forthcoming on the Palestinian issue. Naftali Bennett is gaining in the polls. He's someone who is much more, he's even more hawkish than Netanyahu, right? So on the courts and settlements and all that stuff. So I'm not optimistic on Israeli politics. I haven't been for a long, long time. On Pompeo, really interesting. Again, nothing that grabs the Israeli headlines. With Pompeo, like also appearing on the rooftop of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem 4 days before the U.S. elections. How much of it is geared toward his base in the U.S. and him preparing for running in 2024? I actually said it's like 10 months ago, this probably running, so he will run, and how much it is for him. Yeah, of course, the settlement movement is very happy. It's part of, I mentioned the Tom Cotton letter to the president today. The idea is let's normalize the settlements. We've seen many steps that not to distinguish between the settlements between the West Bank and the state of Israel. This is part of the attempt. It's resonating within certain groups, but I bet I'm 100% convinced that my mother, who watches the news, doesn't even know about it. Okay, so it's not something that is big on the agenda now. I let maybe Ibrahim respond to the other issues.
Yes, please, Ibrahim.
If you could just remind me, basically, I'm going to go with the Secretary Pompeo coming to Psagot. By the way, Psagot is just a few hundred meters away from me, and the only thing that I can tell you as a former U.S. government employee is that I worked for 20 years, but I couldn't actually continue working with this administration as a Palestinian who believed in being a bridge between, the U.S. and the Palestinians. I wish him good retirement after, January 20th. But I'm not gonna comment on that more. And if you could remind me, please, of the two other points that you wanted a quick answer to.
I think if you could, the one other thing, if you could comment on is the question about Hamas-Fatah reconciliation and whether the Biden administration can help with that.
Yes. No, I think, frankly, first of all, with the PA's decision yesterday on resuming coordination with Israel, Hamas threw out a statement very harshly worded against the PA's position and decision and so on. What I want to say is this: is the following fact. Eventually, like the Palestinian house needs to be put in order, and one of the key pillars to it is and will have to be a clear political program that is jointly agreed and is acceptable and sellable to the international community, to the U.S. and to the region. Not only the U.S., to the international community, basically, because we had the bad experience in 2006 of Hamas winning elections and then trying to undo Oslo Agreement and creating, a big mess when taking over the government, and that we cannot repeat, I think, as Palestinians. We need to have a clear political program that all will agree on, and it will meet international, resolutions and international law and PLO commitments, in the region, because at the end of the day, the fate of people is not for factions, it's actually for the official organizations that represent, the people, and that's the PA and the PLO. And on that note, I would say when we have a more genuine, reconciliation process, other regional partners and players in the region other than Israel, because Israel does actually support in many ways, provide Hamas with the support it needs to continue governing Gaza. I'm not going to go into that issue and say they pass cash to Gaza and all of that. But basically, all the regional players, including countries in the region, whether it's Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and others, would want to see a regional effort that brings in that concept that I mentioned into the reconciliation process. So whoever is elected does not cause a catastrophe and a setback in terms of the Palestinian governance or the PLO, the PA vis-a-vis Israel. A repeat of 2006 is going to be a mistake, and that's why I think the PA's and Fatah's position today is very clear-cut and very solid. And if Hamas is not ready yet, I hope that in future engagements that will not be in the too distant future, they would reconnect on that point. But doing it like in 2006, quick fix that results in a major setback is the wrong approach, and I don't really think that there is a need to expedite a process like that.
Yeah, I just want to correct Ibrahim. It's not Israel doesn't send the cash to Hamas. The cash comes from Qatar. Israel only converts US dollars to shekels because that's what they use in Gaza, and they drive the suitcases to Gaza. They don't drive themselves. And you
Thanks
know,
for
this
the
money that
correction,
doesn't
Shir.
go to the, it doesn't just go to the people of Gaza, the poor people. It goes capacity building for Hamas government. So.
No, thank you for the correction. That's a very good point. Yes, and I
Well,
agree fully.
Well, on that note, I want to say I feel like we've covered an enormous amount of ground in this hour and a few extra minutes that I've eked out here for us. I really want to thank our tremendous audience, very large audience, for joining us today, and apologize to those of you who put your questions into the Q&A and we just didn't have time to get to them all, but we had some great questions. I really want to reach out through my video screen here and extend a hand and thank you to Ibrahim joining us from Ramallah, to Shira joining us from Israel. We really appreciate your time and expertise today, and we do just again indicate that the video will be available on J Street's website. You can see the precise URL in the chat. So thank you so much to both of our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks.
And thank you
Thank
to our
you,
audience.
Bye bye. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
great
Good night. Good day.
Thank you. Bye.